Every day, the royal guard stands perfectly still outside the grand palace. His uniform is spotless, a striking combination of deep red and gold, with shiny buttons that gleam in the sunlight. His tall hat, a traditional part of his uniform, towers above his head, adding to his imposing presence. As the sun rises each morning, he takes his position, silently preparing for another long day of duty. The guard's responsibility is not just to protect the palace, but also to uphold the honor of the monarchy he serves. He is the embodiment of tradition, representing centuries of history with each passing minute. The bustling streets around him are filled with tourists from all corners of the world. They come in large groups, excited to catch a glimpse of the royal palace, to take photos, and to witness the grandeur of the place. Among them, the royal guard stands like a statue, unmoving and unflinching. His job is not to interact with the people, but to maintain his composure and keep watch, no matter how many people come and go. To the tourists, the sight of the guard is fascinating. Many are in awe of his ability to stand so still for such long periods. It's not easy. The sun can be unbearably hot, and the cold wind can make him shiver, but he doesn't move. Despite the discomfort, he remains focused. The guards who take on this duty are some of the most disciplined individuals, chosen for their ability to stay calm under pressure. They train for months to get to this point, learning how to stand still, how to remain unfazed by any distraction. The royal guard knows that this duty is not just a job, it's a privilege, one that is taken with the utmost seriousness. Despite the respect that many tourists show, there are always a few who do not understand the gravity of the situation. Some treat the royal guard as if he were a mere attraction, like a statue in a museum. They approach him with smiles and excitement, eager to snap the perfect photo. They don't see the history he represents, nor do they understand the importance of the tradition he upholds. Instead, they see him as someone there for their entertainment. At first, the guard tries to ignore them. After all, it is part of his training to stay focused, to ignore the world around him. But over time, the constant stream of people testing his patience begins to take its toll. He has learned to stand perfectly still, to not react to the noise or the flashing cameras, but it's not always easy. There are moments when a tourist will come too close, perhaps even touch the guard's uniform in an attempt to get a better picture, without any awareness of how disrespectful that can be. These small actions, although not intended to harm, add up over time. The guard is not allowed to show frustration. His job is to stay calm, to never show emotion. But inside, his frustration begins to grow. It's not about the tourists themselves. He understands that many of them don't mean to be disrespectful. They simply don't understand the sacredness of his duty. But day after day, he begins to feel more like an object, a prop for people to take pictures with, rather than a person performing a serious and important role. He wonders if anyone even notices how much effort it takes to remain perfectly still, how much concentration it requires to keep his face expressionless. He tries not to think about it, to focus on his training and his role. But the longer he stands there, the more he begins to feel like an invisible figure, caught between duty and the growing sense of being misunderstood. The tourists, however, are mostly unaware of the inner conflict the guard experiences. For them, the royal guard is just part of the experience, a living piece of history to be admired for a moment, then forgotten as they move on to the next attraction. Some laugh and joke around, posing next to him, waving their hands in front of his face, and sometimes even making silly faces to try and get a reaction. They see him as a living statue, unfeeling, unchanging, and part of the spectacle. Every now and then, the guard catches the eye of someone who seems to understand. A respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. These moments remind him of the importance of his role and the respect he's meant to receive. But those moments are rare. Most of the time, it's just the crowd, eager for their photos and their moments of fun. They don't realize how exhausting it is to stand still, to give so much of oneself to something so invisible, so quiet as the days pass. The guard finds himself reflecting more on his role. He has always taken pride in the discipline he has learned, and the honor of serving the royal family and representing the traditions of his country. But as he stands there, day after day, facing the same cycle of tourists treating him as a mere backdrop, he begins to wonder if anyone truly understands the meaning of his job. Is anyone aware of the sacrifice it takes to stay motionless, to give up a part of yourself for something so much bigger than you? He looks around at the sea of faces, some smiling and snapping photos, others pointing at him with excitement. It is clear that many are enjoying the spectacle, but the royal guard wonders if they really see him at all. Do they understand that he is not just there for their amusement? He is not a toy, nor is he a statue. He is a person, a soldier, a symbol of something far more significant than a passing tourist attraction. Despite his feelings, the guard continues to stand there, his eyes trained on the distance. His posture remains perfect, his focus unwavering. He knows that his duty is not just to stand guard, but to embody the history and the dignity of the monarchy. He must be the living representation of something much larger than himself, a tradition that spans centuries. No matter how many tourists come and go, no matter how many times he is treated as nothing more than an object in their photos, he knows that his job is to remain calm, to remain still, and to continue to protect the honor of the royal family. It is not an easy task, and the guard sometimes wonders how much longer he can maintain this composure. But he does it because that is his role. It is his duty. And even though the tourists may never understand the full weight of his responsibility, he knows that he will continue to stand there, as he always has, unwavering and resolute. As the weeks passed, the royal guard continued his duties without fail. He stood tall every day in front of the palace, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged. His dedication to his role had never wavered. Even though the crowds of tourists seemed to grow larger and louder with each passing day, what had once been a peaceful routine of silent watchfulness slowly began to feel more like a test of patience. At first, the tourists who came by were respectful. They admired the guard, snapping pictures from a distance, occasionally waving, and even thanking him for the chance to witness such a noble tradition. It was a moment of awe for them. After all, how many people could say they stood next to a real-life royal guard? But slowly over time, the behavior of some visitors began to shift. The first signs of trouble were small, but noticeable. A few. Tourists began to get closer to the guard, thinking that if they stood close enough, they could capture a better photo. At first, the guard didn't react. He simply stood still, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed on the horizon, focusing on the task at hand. But this gradual encroachment on his personal space began to increase over time. The group of tourists would surround him, excitedly pointing their cameras at him from all angles, sometimes standing inches away from his uniform. Some even posed beside him, smiling and laughing as if they were standing next to a statue. The guard remained still, but inside, his frustration grew. He knew that these people weren't trying to cause harm, but they were treating him as though he were no different from a painted portrait or a piece of art. He was there to protect and uphold the dignity of the royal family, and yet they didn't seem to understand the importance of his presence. For the first time, the guard started to feel like he was invisible to them, just part of the background scenery. It wasn't that he minded taking photos. It was the way people approached him, as if his job was to entertain them rather than serve a higher purpose. As the days turned into weeks, the guard began to notice patterns in the behavior of the tourists. Some of them would giggle and try to make him smile or laugh, thinking that it would be amusing. Others would challenge his stillness, walking right in front of him and waving their hands to see if they could get a reaction. At times, a group of young people would try to provoke him further, jumping in front of him and making silly faces, testing whether he would crack under the pressure. The guard could feel his patience being tested in ways that went beyond his training. One afternoon, a group of tourists came up to him and, with a sense of curiosity, began to pose for pictures. At first, it was just the usual, a few friendly smiles, a quick picture, and then they moved on. But soon, one of them stepped too close, even touching the guard's uniform to get a better angle for her photo. The guard, feeling the weight of his frustration, stood his ground, but inside, his resolve was beginning to falter. He couldn't show it, but every part of him screamed for the tourists to understand, to respect the duty he was carrying out. Then came the incident that made the guard question just how much longer he could remain silent. A young man, full of excitement and enthusiasm, decided to make the guard's stillness into a game. He walked right up to him, smiling and loudly. Asked, "Hey, why don't you smile for the camera?" The man's voice was filled with playfulness, and the tourists around him laughed, thinking it was all in good fun. But this was no game to the guard. To him, this was an insult to everything he stood for. His job wasn't to entertain, to smile, or to be a subject for amusement. It was a sacred duty that required discipline, focus, and respect. The young man's comment hit a nerve deep inside him. How many more times would he have to silently endure the disrespect of these tourists who treated him like a performer in a show? The guard could feel the weight of every passing day, each one more challenging than the last. More and more, he began to feel invisible. Tourists would approach him, taking photos with no thought of the responsibility he carried. To them, he was just part of the palace's charm, like a prop in a grand production. They did not see him as a man, as a soldier, or as a person carrying out a sacred duty. The growing disregard for his presence became harder to ignore. The guard, usually a picture of composure and calm, began to question his own limits. Much longer could he stand there, day after day, enduring the jokes, the laughter, the selfies, and the casual disrespect that seemed to increase with every new wave of tourists? But it wasn't just the tourists who tested his patience. It was the overwhelming sense that, despite his best efforts, he wasn't seen for who he truly was. People saw a soldier in a uniform, but they didn't see the years of training, the countless hours spent preparing for this role, or the pride that came with serving the royal family. He wasn't just a statue. He wasn't just there for entertainment. He was standing guard, a living symbol of tradition. A sentinel who represented centuries of history. The crowd seemed to grow bigger with each passing day. It was like a parade of strangers who passed by, unaware of the man standing before them. They came for the photos, the memories, and the experience, but none of them understood the cost of his stillness. How long could the guard continue to hold his ground, while the world around him treated him as little more than a spectacle? It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the tourists. Many of them came to witness history, to experience the grandeur of the royal palace. But for those who didn't understand, who thought his presence was just part of the entertainment, it was beginning to feel like an unbearable weight. The guard was no longer just standing to protect the palace. He was standing to protect something much deeper, the dignity of his role, the respect for the tradition, and the pride in the service he was providing. At times, he would glance around at the sea of faces, hoping to find one person who understood the significance of his presence. Someone who would look beyond the uniform and see the man standing there, silently bearing the weight of his duty. But those moments were few and far between. Most of the time, he was just another figure in the background, a living prop for the tourists to photograph, and yet, despite the frustration, despite the growing sense of being misunderstood, the guard remained there, still and silent. He knew that this was his role, this was his responsibility. No matter how much the tourists disrespected him, no matter how much they tested his patience, he would stand tall. It was his duty to protect the dignity of the monarchy and to honor the tradition he served. But even a soldier with the strongest resolve has his breaking point. The guard couldn't help but wonder how much longer could he endure this relentless cycle. How much longer could he keep his composure as the world around him seemed to forget who he truly was? The day had started like any other. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, casting warm rays over the bustling streets that led to the royal palace. The usual crowd of tourists had already begun to gather, their excited chatter filling the air. The royal guard stood at his post, his back straight, and his eyes fixed on the distance, scanning for any signs of danger, as he had done countless times before. His uniform, as always, was crisp and perfect, with every detail in place. He remained completely still, focused on his task, just as he had been trained to do. The tourists came in waves, each group eager to capture a moment of history. Some approached the guard with respect, giving him space, snapping a quick photo, and moving on. Others, however, did not understand the importance of his role. They gathered around him, laughing and joking, hoping for some kind of reaction. They crowded too close, some even leaning against the guard's uniform or making silly faces as if he were part of the scene at the palace. For the guard, these moments had become all too familiar, but today felt different. As the crowd grew larger, a sense of tension hung in the air. The guard's patience had already been tested for weeks. He had endured countless moments of disrespect, each one wearing him down a little more. He had tried to remain professional, to stay focused on his duty, but today, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a single moment that caused it, but rather the cumulative weight of everything he had endured. A group of tourists, led by a young woman, approached the guard. She was holding a camera, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. She had clearly been waiting for this moment all day. Without thinking, she stepped right in front of the guard, aiming her camera at his face. She smiled, trying to get his attention, hoping he would break his stillness for just a second. "Hey, smile for the camera," she called out, her voice lighthearted and full of expectation. The tourists around her laughed, some even encouraging her to get a reaction from the guard. It was the same old routine, try to get the guard to smile or show some emotion. They saw it as a fun challenge, a way to break the ice with a soldier who never moved, never showed a flicker of expression. They didn't realize that this was not a game. This was his duty, and his silence was a reflection of his dedication. The young woman moved closer, pushing the boundaries even further. She raised her camera even higher, practically in the guard's face, attempting to capture the perfect shot. She wasn't thinking about the history or the tradition she was interrupting. She was only thinking about her photo, her experience. To her, the guard was just a part of the scenery. Something to be admired from a distance, but also something to be conquered. To be included in her picture as a symbol of the moment, something inside the guard snapped. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time in weeks, he felt his resolve falter. The pressure of standing there, enduring the constant poking and prodding, the disregard for his role, built up inside him like a storm waiting to break. He had stood still for so long, never once stepping out of line or reacting to the disrespect he felt. But today, he couldn't remain silent anymore. With one swift movement, the guard took a step forward, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Please step back," he said, his tone firm and steady, but with an edge that surprised even him. The tourists around him fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees and the distant chatter of other visitors. They stared at him, unsure of how to react. The young woman, who had been so excited to capture the perfect shot, now found herself facing a completely different situation. The guard had spoken, and for the first time, he had broken the silence that had defined his presence for so long. The tourists exchanged looks, some of them unsure if what they had just witnessed was real. Had the guard really spoken? Had he actually reacted to them? It was almost as if the magic of the moment had shattered, and in its place was the reality of the guard's quiet power. For the guard, it was a strange mix of relief and regret. He had finally reacted, finally broken the silence. But in doing so, he realized how much of his own patience had been tested. How many more days could he stand there, pretending that the treatment he received didn't affect him? How many more times could he endure the same disrespect without showing that he was, in fact, a person? He had tried so hard to maintain his composure, to stay professional. But there was a limit to how much anyone could take, as the young woman took a step back. Her face flushed with embarrassment. The guard felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had reacted. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, nor was it a grand spectacle. It was simple, direct, and enough to make the tourists realize that there were boundaries that should not be crossed. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some of the tourists whispering among themselves, while others quietly took a step back, giving the guard more space. The excitement that had once filled the air now seemed to dissipate, replaced by an uneasy silence. The guard, however, didn't move. He remained still, as if nothing had changed, his posture as perfect as ever. But in his mind, things had shifted. He had drawn the line, and for the first time in a long while, he had made his feelings known. The rest of the day went on without incident. But the guard couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He had finally reacted, and the tourists had taken notice. The royal guard was no longer just a figure in a uniform. He was a person with limits, with a voice, and with the right to stand up for himself. It wasn't that he had wanted to yell or create a scene, but he had reached a point where his quiet endurance had to give way to the reality of his experience. He had his own dignity to protect, just as much as he had the monarchy's. The event would become a moment that the tourists would talk about. The story of the guard who finally spoke up would spread quickly through social media and word of mouth. Some would praise him for standing up for himself, while others would criticize him for breaking his silence. But for the guard, the truth was clear. He had reached his breaking point. He had finally reacted, and now, the tourists would have to remember that he was not just a living statue to be poked and prodded at their will. He was a man with his own duty, his own purpose, and his own sense of respect. And so, as the sun began to set, the royal guard stood once again at his post, his eyes still focused on the distance, his body as still as ever. But in his mind, he knew that something had changed. He had reacted. He had shown the world that even those who seem unshakable have their limits, and that in itself was a powerful message. The incident that day had sparked something unexpected. It wasn't just a moment where the royal guard had spoken up. It was a moment that resonated beyond the walls of the palace, beyond the quiet stillness of his post. As news spread through social media and conversations at cafes, the story of the royal guard who had finally reacted caught the attention of people far and wide. Videos were shared, comments were made, and opinions flooded in from every corner of the world. For many, the guard's reaction was a symbol of standing up for oneself, a powerful reminder that even those who seem invincible and unmovable have their limits. People admired his courage to break his silence, to step out of the quiet duty that had defined his role for so long. They saw him not just as a soldier in uniform, but as a person who had finally asserted his own boundaries. The respect that he had silently longed for from the public was now being given to him, but in an unexpected way, as the news spread. People began to reflect on their own behavior. Tourists who had once approached the guard without much thought now began to consider what their actions might mean. They saw the story not as an isolated event, but as a broader lesson in respect. What had seemed like a harmless photo op, a playful moment, was now being seen in a different light. Social media buzzed with discussions about the guard's right to dignity, the importance of recognizing the humanity behind the uniform. It was clear that the guard's actions had made people stop and think about the way they treated others, especially those in roles that demanded respect. The royal palace, a place that had always been a symbol of power and tradition, now found itself at the center of a different kind of attention. The story of the guard's reaction became a topic of conversation in the media. News outlets, both local and international, covered the story, and it sparked debates among various groups of people. Some praised the guard for his professionalism and courage, while others debated whether the tourists were truly at fault. In the end, the story was not just about the guard's reaction. It was about the larger idea of respect, boundaries, and understanding. It was a conversation that transcended borders, reaching far beyond the streets of the royal palace. The royal family, too, released a statement. They expressed support for the guard, acknowledging the difficulty of his role and the importance of respect for those who serve in such positions. The statement was measured and thoughtful, reflecting the values of the monarchy. It wasn't an angry or defensive response. It was an invitation for the public to reflect on the values that had always been at the heart of their service to the country. The royal family recognized that the guard's action was not just an isolated moment of frustration. It was a reminder to all of the respect that must be given to those who dedicate themselves to the service of others in the days that followed. The atmosphere around the palace began to change. Tourists who visited the site now seemed more aware of the guard's role. They took more care when approaching him, recognizing that he wasn't a mere figure to be photographed, but a person fulfilling a duty. People still smiled for pictures, but there was a newfound respect in their interactions. The constant chatter, the attempts to get a reaction, the playful jabs, they all seemed to lessen. The guard's action had created a shift in the way people viewed him. His silence had been broken, but it had opened up a larger conversation that was now changing the way people acted. While many were supportive, others questioned whether the guard had done the right thing. There were some who felt that he had overreacted, that the tourist's behavior, while perhaps a bit intrusive, didn't warrant such a strong response. Some believed that part of the guard's role was to endure, no matter the circumstances. They argued that the respect for the monarchy and the traditions of the country should remain unwavering, even in the face of disrespect. These voices, though, were in the minority. The majority seemed to agree that the guard's reaction had been justified, and that his role, as much as it was a symbol of discipline, should also be recognized as a human one. For the guard himself, the aftermath was a mixture of emotions. He was grateful for the support he had received from the public and the royal family, but he also felt conflicted. He hadn't acted out of anger, but out of necessity. The incident had been a long time coming. Every day spent standing in silence, enduring the same behavior, had chipped away at his composure. His decision to speak had been a moment of clarity, a moment where he drew a line and said, "This is where my patience ends." Yet, as the days passed and the attention faded, he began to reflect on the consequences of that action. Did it change the way people saw him? Did it change the way he viewed his duty? The guard returned to his post just as he had always done. He stood there, once again in silence, his uniform perfect, his stance as steadfast as ever. But now, there was something different about the way he carried himself. He felt more seen, more acknowledged. His quiet demeanor still held the same strength, but it was now underpinned by the knowledge that people understood his role. The respect that had been absent for so long was slowly starting to return. And while he had not expected such a dramatic shift, it brought a sense of peace. In the following weeks, the crowds continued to visit the palace. But there was a palpable difference in the way they interacted with the royal guard. Many approached him with a sense of reverence, more mindful of the respect his role demanded. The photos were still taken, the smiles still shared, but now there was an understanding that the guard was not just a prop in their vacation photos, but a person who represented something far greater than themselves. It was a small but important change, one that spoke volumes about the power of a single action to spark reflection and change. As time went on, the guard's presence became even more respected. He remained at his post, still as unyielding as ever. But now, there was a sense of pride in the way people looked at him. He had become not just a symbol of the royal family, but a symbol of dignity, patience, and the importance of standing up for what is right. In the end, the guard's reaction had not only changed the way people saw him, but it had also changed the way they saw themselves, and the way they interacted with the world around them. Days passed, and life seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The royal guard stood at his post, unwavering and steadfast, just as he always had. His uniform was spotless, his posture as perfect as ever, and his eyes focused on the distance with the same dedication he had shown for years. Yet something inside him had changed. The events of the past few weeks, his moment of reaction, the public attention, and the wave of respect that followed had left an indelible mark on him. He had not just stood at his post physically, but now he stood with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. The tourists who came to visit the palace had begun to treat him with more respect. It was as if the entire atmosphere had shifted. People still took pictures and smiled, but now there was a deeper understanding behind their smiles. The crowd that had once surrounded him like a noisy, laughing mob was now more mindful of his presence. They saw him as more than just a part of the scenery. They saw him as a person with a role, a responsibility, a dignity that deserved respect. Some tourists would still approach him, their curiosity shining through, but they did so with more caution. They understood now that he was not there to entertain them or to be a subject for their jokes. The moments of humor and playful interactions had faded, replaced by a quieter sense of admiration. It was as though the royal guard had in some ways become a symbol not just of the monarchy, but of something greater: respect, strength, the power of silently standing for what is right. It wasn't about the uniform he wore, but the values it represented, for the guard. This change was both rewarding and strange. He had spent so many years standing in silence, never once allowing himself to react, never once stepping outside the boundaries of his role. Yet, the one moment he allowed himself to speak up to break the silence It sparked a shift in the way people interacted with him. He had shown the world that even those who seem unmoved, those who appear as if they can endure anything, still have their breaking points. His moment of reaction had reminded people of the importance of seeing others as human beings, not just symbols or statues. While the guard appreciated the newfound respect, he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. The public had recognized him, and in doing so, they had raised his role to something more than just a duty. He had become a symbol in a way he had never expected. He had always believed that standing at his post was enough, that his silent dedication would speak for itself. But now he realized that it wasn't just his stillness that people admired. It was his humanity, his ability to be firm yet fair, silent yet powerful. He had always stood for something bigger than himself, the royal family, the tradition of the monarchy and the history that was carried by every step he took. But now he understood that his presence carried even more. It carried the message that even in a world that often overlooks the small acts of dedication, there is strength in staying true to one's values, in remaining firm even when it seems like no one is paying attention, but not everyone understood the full extent of what had happened. While many tourists now treated the guard with respect, there were still a few who didn't get the message. Occasionally, someone would come too close, trying to capture a quick photo or make a joke. The guard would calmly ask them to step back, reminding them once again of the boundaries that had been set. But now, there was a sense of authority in his voice, a quiet power that he hadn't fully realized he had gained. People listened. They could see that he wasn't just speaking because he had to. He was speaking because he deserved that respect. The royal family, too, noticed the change. The statement they had made in support of the guard had reached even more people than they had expected. It was a statement that wasn't just about the guard, but about the values of the monarchy itself. It wasn't about defending a single individual, but about defending the respect and honor that everyone in such a role deserved. The royal family expressed their gratitude to the public for their understanding, acknowledging that the guard's duty was not an easy one, and that his reaction was a sign of how much he had given to his role over the years. They also expressed their thanks to the guard for his continued service, which had shown that standing firm in one's principles was a sign of strength, not weakness. For the guard, this recognition was humbling. He had never asked for attention or praise. All he had ever wanted was to do his duty with dignity and pride. But now he felt as though he had become a part of something larger, something that wasn't just about standing still in a uniform, but about standing for the values that had shaped the country's history. His actions had sparked a change, not just in how the public viewed him, but in how they viewed the very idea of respect. As the weeks turned into months, the guard continued his duties. The tourists still came, the crowd still gathered, but now there was a deeper awareness in the air. The atmosphere around the palace was calmer, more respectful. People still took their photos, but they did so with a sense of understanding. They no longer saw the guard as just a figure to be posed next to, but as a person who had earned the right to be treated with honor. The guard's actions had shown that there is power in quiet strength. He hadn't needed to make a scene, hadn't needed to raise his voice, or demand attention. All he had needed was to speak when the time was right, to show that even those who seem invincible can have their limits. His quiet act of standing up for himself had echoed far beyond the walls of the palace, reminding people of the importance of dignity and respect, and so life went on at the royal palace. The guard stood at his post, as he always had, with his head held high and his eyes fixed on the distance. He had become a symbol, but more than that, he had become a reminder to everyone who passed by that respect should never be taken for granted, that even in the most traditional roles, there is a human being behind the uniform, and that sometimes all it takes to change the way people see you is one simple act of standing up for yourself. Though the tourists still gathered, and the palace still drew crowds from around the world, the royal guard no longer felt invisible. He had drawn the line, and in doing so, he had made the world take notice. He had reminded everyone that silence, though powerful, could also speak volumes when the time was right. And most importantly, he had shown that no one, not even the most disciplined, can endure disrespect forever.